Hey guys, let's dive into one of the harshest realities of the past. Forget the cozy snowfalls we picture in movies or on Christmas cards. In the Victorian age, when winter storms swept across Britain, snow was not romantic. It was merciless. And imagine this: no gas lamps to light the streets, no central heating to warm your home, and no easy way to summon help when the cold pressed in like an enemy. A snowstorm wasn't just weather. It was a test of survival, and for the poor especially, it was a fight against nature itself. The first thing to understand is how unevenly this storm was felt. Wealthy families in their grand houses might complain about coal deliveries being delayed or parlors growing drafty. But for the poor, crammed into tenements or wooden cottages with broken panes and leaking roofs, the storm was a predator at the door. It crept in through every crack, every seam of timber, until it wasn't outside anymore, it was already inside. Now, think about the streets themselves. Victorian cities like London or Manchester didn't come to a graceful winter halt with children building snowmen. They were buried. Horses struggled to stay upright on icy cobblestones, their breaths steaming like smoke in the air. Carriages vanished under white drifts, abandoned mid-street. Shopkeepers shuttered their doors early, praying their supplies would last, and when the gas lamps went out, entire neighborhoods were swallowed in darkness. Can you imagine the silence, broken only by the howl of wind and the creak of roofs ready to cave under the weight of snow? Inside the homes of the wealthy, servants rushed from room to room, stuffing cloth in window frames, hauling coal scuttles, and trying to keep fires alive in every hearth. Curtains were drawn heavy, carpets sometimes nailed to walls to keep drafts out. But even so, frost still crawled across the windows like delicate lace, a reminder that nature didn't care how thick your walls were. Comfort could be bought, but immunity? Never. For the poor, the picture was far bleaker. Families shoved rags, newspapers, and scraps of fabric into gaps in their walls, hoping to block the wind. Children were sent to sit in corners where two walls met, because even their small bodies could serve as insulation. Roofs sagged with snow, dripping meltwater onto straw beds already damp from the cold. Imagine trying to sleep while water dripped steadily onto your blanket, freezing before it could even soak in. Buckets were set beneath leaks, but by morning the water inside had frozen solid. That was the futility of winter. And then there was the matter of fire. Fire was everything. Without it, there was no warmth, no light, no way to cook the scraps of food that were left. For the wealthy, coal was a lifeline. Their cellars held black mounds of it, enough to keep flames roaring for weeks. But even they feared what would happen once the roads closed and no more deliveries could get through. For the poor, fire was fragile. They couldn't afford coal, so they scavenged broken crates, discarded rags, even bits of furniture torn from their own homes. Banisters, doors, floorboards, all were sacrificed to keep the embers alive just one more night, and you couldn't just let the fire burn freely. Matches were expensive, flints unreliable, and damp wood stubborn to catch. Families sat in shifts through the night, eyes heavy but unwilling to sleep, poking the embers and feeding them just enough scraps to keep them alive. To let the fire die was more than carelessness. It was negligence that could cost an entire family their lives by morning. But fire came with its own cruel price. Chimneys in poor homes were crooked or non-existent, so smoke clung inside. The air turned thick and acrid, coating lungs in soot. Children coughed until their ribs ached. The elderly wheezed through the nights, their shallow breaths rattling like old windows in the wind. Yet no one dared extinguish the flame. Better to breathe smoke than freeze to death. It was always a choice between two evils, and then food. Here, the divide between rich and poor was most brutal. Wealthy families had pantries stocked with salted meats, pickled vegetables, preserves, and flour. They cut back during storms, thinner soups, smaller portions, but they still ate. For the poor, survival meant stretching a loaf of coarse bread across a week. Bones were boiled again and again until the broth was little more than cloudy water. And still it was served. When even that was gone, families turned to nettles, weeds, or tree bark boiled into bitter stews. Hunger was relentless. It hollowed cheeks, stole energy, and left even the strong staggering with exhaustion. Parents often gave their share to their children, swallowing nothing but water so that the little ones might live another day. Water itself wasn't simple either. Wells froze. Streams turned to glassy ribbons. Buckets cracked in the cold. So families gathered snow in baskets, only to watch a heap shrink into a trickle of liquid once melted. But snow carried soot and dirt, and without fuel to boil it properly, drinking it could bring sickness. And yet thirst left no choice. Imagine trudging out into the storm with numb hands just to bring back enough snow to melt for a single pot of broth. That was daily life. And speaking of sickness, the storm made every cough terrifying. Smoke from poor fires irritated lungs, damp bedding chilled already weak bodies, and hunger stripped away strength. A cough could become pneumonia, tuberculosis, or worse. With no antibiotics, a child's shallow breath at night might be the beginning of the end. Doctors were for the wealthy. The poor had folk remedies, herbal teas, and whispered prayers. Sometimes it soothed. More often, it didn't. And yet in all this misery, there were flashes of resilience. Families stitched together rag blankets from old coats, sacks, and torn skirts. The patchwork was heavy, ugly, and often damp, but it trapped warmth. Communities built shared fires in alleys, each family contributing a scrap of fuel so that at least for a few hours, the storm felt a little less cruel. Neighbors passed glowing coals from house to house, a simple ember carried in a pot that meant the difference between life and death. And when cupboards were bare, some still shared a crust of bread or a cup of broth, even when they couldn't afford to. Faith, too, was a fire of its own. Families gathered in churches, their hymns echoing off stone walls, voices trembling but unbroken. To the poor, suffering was not meaningless. It was a trial, a test of spirit. Belief didn't fill bellies, but it filled hearts with just enough strength to face another day. When the thaw finally came, it didn't arrive like a celebration. It crept in slowly, with the drip of melting icicles, the return of birdsong, the muddy reveal of earth beneath the snow. Children rushed outside to laugh and splash in puddles, their joy a defiance against weeks of fear. Parents wept quietly, shoulders loosening for the first time in months. But the thaw also revealed scars. Collapsed roofs, dead animals, churchyards newly filled with small graves. Relief mingled with grief. Survival had come, but not without cost. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. Today we complain about heating bills or icy sidewalks, But we forget how fragile winter once was. A Victorian snowstorm without gas was not an inconvenience. It was war. And the poor fought it not with wealth, but with scraps, ingenuity, and sheer willpower. Their story is not one of despair, but of resistance. And in their resilience lies a legacy that still humbles us. So as we move through this journey together, let's peel back the layers of this storm piece by piece. How did families really survive the nights? What sacrifices were made? And what lessons did they leave us, hidden in the ashes of their fires and the stitches of their ragged bodies? Quilts? Because this isn't just about history. It's about humanity's ability to endure when everything else is stripped away. Last time we explored the brutal divide between rich and poor during those merciless Victorian snowstorms. But to really understand how people clung to life, we need to zero in on the one thing that stood between survival and death: fire. It's easy for us today to take flame for granted. A flick of a lighter, a turn of a knob, and heat floods a room. But back then, fire wasn't convenience. It was a lifeline. Imagine being in a cottage with snow piled high against the door, the wind howling through cracks, and every wall trembling. Your only defense was a fragile hearth, a handful of damp wood, or maybe just a scrap of coal. That glow in the dark corner of the room wasn't just light, it was breath itself. And yet keeping fire alive was a battle every single night. The wealthy had the advantage. Coal deliveries had filled their cellars before the storm, black mounds piled high like treasure. Servants kept the hearths blazing, feeding lump after lump until every parlor flickered with orange warmth. Curtains were drawn, furniture gleamed in the glow, and laughter could sometimes be heard even as the storm raged outside. But let's be clear, even they worried. Deliveries stopped once the streets froze over. Every log tossed onto the flames whispered the same question: what if the coal runs out? For the poor, the fight was far more desperate. Coal was a dream. Wood was scarce. So families scavenged anything that would burn: broken chairs, banisters ripped from stairways, even floorboards torn from beneath their feet. Imagine that. Feeding your home into its own fire just so your children could sleep without freezing. The walls shook, the roof leaked, but inside, the flames ate away at the very bones of the house. Desperation turned shelter into fuel. And still, fire demanded care. Matches were precious, often rationed to the very last. Flint and steel could spark, but only if your hands were steady and the kindling dry. And in a snowstorm, nothing was ever truly dry. Damp twigs hissed, rags smoked, and embers sputtered stubbornly. To let the fire die wasn't just an accident, it was a death sentence. That's why families kept watch. Night after night, they sat in shifts by the hearth. Fathers, mothers, even children took turns nudging embers, coaxing the flame to stay alive. Think about that for a moment. Children no older than 8 or 9 sat bleary-eyed, poking sticks into the fire, fighting sleep because they knew that if the flames faded, everyone in the house might never wake again. Childhood wasn't spared by the storm, it was stolen. The storm demanded labor from every hand, no matter how small. But the fire wasn't only friend, it was also enemy. Poor chimneys clogged with soot and ice, sending smoke curling back into rooms already choked with damp. Families huddled close to the flames for warmth, but the closer they drew, the more poison they inhaled. Coughs rattled in the darkness. Children wheezed, their lungs raw. Grandparents bent double, struggling to breathe. And yet no one dared smother the flames. The choice was cruel but simple. Choke on smoke or freeze in silence. Every wall told the story. Black streaks of soot painted the plaster. Ceilings dripped tar. Clothes reeked of smoke, no matter how much you scrubbed. Even skin carried the stench. Fire gave life, but it also scarred everything it touched. And when the fire died, because sometimes it did, the terror was immediate. The cold swept in like a predator freed from its cage. Blankets stiffened, breaths turned to frost, and mothers pressed their children tighter, desperate to keep them alive, until someone could relight the hearth. But striking flint with frozen fingers was agony. One failed spark meant another minute lost, another degree stolen from the body. Sometimes there was no choice but to stumble into the storm itself, carrying a clay pot or iron pan, praying to borrow a coal from a neighbor's fire. Many owed their survival to those midnight missions. Some never returned. And yet, through all this struggle, the flame became something almost sacred. Families treated embers as though they were members of the household. They were fed, guarded, and mourned when they died. Fire was not just a tool, it was a companion. Its crackle was a lullaby, its glow a guardian, its warmth the only barrier between life and the storm's merciless grip. But here's what fascinates me most. Even in those desperate conditions, people found ways to make fire feel like home. They gathered around it, told stories, sang songs, whispered prayers. Children stared into the flames as though they were alive, finding comfort in its dance. Parents let the glow soften their faces, hiding their fear so the little ones might believe the world was safe, even if only for a moment. Fire wasn't just heat, it was hope, and when food was scarce, fire transformed scraps into meals. Bones boiled again and again, weeds simmered into thin broth, bread crusts softened in steam. The flavor didn't matter. What mattered was that fire turned nothing into something, emptiness into survival. So when we talk about Victorian snowstorms, remember this: survival hinged on fire. Not just in the wealthy homes where coal burned bright, but in the poorest cottages where scraps sputtered weakly in smoky hearths. Every ember was a heartbeat. Every flicker was a declaration, we're still here. And that's why, in the face of such merciless winters, the poorest weren't just victims, they were fighters. Every stick gathered, every rag burned, every ember protected was an act of defiance against the storm. And that defiance, more than wealth, more than coal, is what kept humanity alive through nights that should have ended them. We've talked about fire, friends, the fragile heartbeat of survival, but warmth alone wasn't enough. What really broke families, what carved scars into bodies and hearts, was hunger. When we picture winter today, most of us think of hot soup simmering on the stove, cupboards lined with cans, maybe even a freezer full of food just waiting. But step back into the Victorian era, into a storm so merciless it buried entire streets, and food became more than a necessity. It became obsession, desperation, sometimes even despair. The wealthy, of course, started off better. Their kitchens held salted meats, jars of preserves, pickled vegetables, flour sacks stacked in cellars. They might not have feasts during the storm, but meals still arrived on their tables. Broths, roasts, warm bread, perhaps smaller portions, but still enough to fill stomachs. For them, hunger meant losing comfort. For the poor, hunger meant losing life. Most poor families entered the storm with almost nothing. Maybe a small sack of oats, a crust of stale bread, or a few potatoes. Within days, these were gone. And then the real struggle began. Parents stretched scraps into meals. Bones, sometimes just one or two, were boiled over and over again until the broth turned from rich to pale, then to nothing but cloudy water. Children were fed this thin liquid as though it were nourishment, and sometimes it was the only thing standing between them and starvation. Bread crusts too hard to chew were soaked in that same broth, softened enough to fill a belly, if not to satisfy it. Onion skins, carrot tops, wilted leaves, anything normally tossed aside, were hoarded, boiled into soups, and passed around the family bowl. And when even those scraps ran out, the poor turned to weeds, nettles pulled from beneath the melting snow, bark stripped from trees and shaved into thin strips, boiled into bitter stew. Can you imagine that? A father watching his children slurp at a bowl of bark broth, pretending it was food, just to keep hope alive. Mothers placing a single potato slice on each plate, stretching one potato into a meal for 6, and then going hungry themselves so the little ones might feel full, if only for a moment. Sacrifice was everywhere. Parents lied to their children, claiming they had eaten earlier, pushing their portions across the table. Elders sometimes refused food entirely, insisting it be saved for the young, even though everyone knew what that meant. Quiet starvation, silent goodbyes. Love turned into suffering so others might live. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at the spirit. Children grew restless, weak, their laughter fading into whimpers. Their cheeks hollowed, their eyes dulled, until they seemed more like shadows than children. The elderly weakened fastest, their bodies too frail to resist. And even the strong staggered, their energy drained, until the simple act of gathering firewood or fetching water felt like climbing a mountain. And when hunger pressed hardest, suspicion sometimes crept in. Neighbors whispered about who might still have grain, who was hiding food, who hadn't yet thinned as much as the rest. Desperation tore at trust. Yet, at the same time, there were moments of astonishing generosity. A neighbor slipping a crust of bread into another's hands, a mother giving her last bit of broth to a stranger's child. These acts didn't erase the hunger, but they lit sparks of humanity in the bleakest nights. Of course, the wealthy still felt the storm. Deliveries stopped, pantries dwindled, and suddenly luxuries like pastries or imported fruit disappeared. But let's be honest, going without cake was nothing compared to a poor family watching their children cry themselves to sleep with empty stomachs. The storm drew a brutal line. One side lost indulgence, the other side lost life. And hunger was more than discomfort. It was a killer. Without food, bodies couldn't fight the cold. Fevers raged hotter, coughs cut deeper, recovery slipped further out of reach. Hunger didn't just weaken it, invited death to the table. Still, families fought with everything they had. They rationed fiercely, cutting bread thinner, pouring more water into broth, chewing slower to trick their minds into believing they'd eaten more. Mealtimes became rituals of hope, even if the portions were laughably small. Parents pretended fullness so their children wouldn't feel guilty. Children pretended they weren't hungry to spare their parents pain. And yet, hunger left scars that outlasted the storm. Survivors carried it with them for years. They hoarded food, hid bread in cupboards, never trusted a full pantry again. That fear, that memory of emptiness was harder to erase than frostbite scars. So when we talk about Victorian snowstorms, let's not just picture people shivering by smoky fires. Let's picture them staring at empty cupboards, boiling the same bone for the 5th time, scraping bark into a pot, or watching a child chew on weeds as though they were a feast. That was the reality of hunger. And yet, against all odds, many endured. Because survival wasn't just about eating, it was about fighting, sacrificing, and believing that somehow spring would come. The endless gnaw that turned scraps into treasures. But survival in a Victorian snowstorm wasn't only about food, it was also about water. And here's the cruel irony. During a storm, water was everywhere. Snow blanketed rooftops, streets, and fields. Streams froze solid. Wells turned to stone. Buckets cracked with ice. Water was all around, but none of it was easy to drink. For the wealthy, water was a challenge, but not a catastrophe. Their servants hacked ice from ponds, scooped frozen blocks from wells, and hauled it back inside to melt over roaring coal fires. It was grueling work for those at the bottom of the household, but for the families inside, water kept flowing. The tea kettles still steamed. Hot baths still happened, though less often, and when they drank, it was from glasses filled with clean, melted snow, made safe because they had the fuel to boil it. The poor, though they faced a different reality. With fires that sputtered low and coal they could barely afford, melting snow became an exhausting gamble. A pot stuffed full of snow shrank down to just a few sips once it melted. Children trudged outside with sacks, scooping icy handfuls until their fingers turned blue, carrying home baskets that looked heavy but yielded almost nothing once set over the hearth. And every trip outside risked frostbite, or worse, collapsing in the white silence and never returning. Families learned quickly that melted snow was tricky. It wasn't clean. It carried soot from the rooftops, dirt from the streets, even waste swept into alleys. Boiling made it safer, but boiling required fuel, and fuel was already more precious than gold. Many couldn't afford to waste a single stick of wood on water, so they drank it cold, cloudy, hoping it wouldn't bring sickness. Often, it did. Can you imagine a mother holding a cup of half-melted snow to her child's lips, knowing it might cause stomach cramps or worse, but having no other choice? That was daily life. And thirst gnawed at the body faster than hunger. A person can last weeks without food, but only days without water. Men braved frozen rivers, hacking at the ice with picks, axes, or even rocks, trying to reach the dark water beneath. It was brutal work. The wind howled, their hands cracked and bled, and one wrong step could send them plunging into the icy black depths. Few who fell in survived. Still, they kept going, because a jug of water could mean the difference between life and death. Inside the cottages, water became as sacred as fire. Mothers rationed it carefully, pouring just enough into a bowl of oats to make a thin gruel, just enough to soften a crust of bread so a child could swallow. Bowls were shallow, cups half-filled, because every drop was counted. Children begged for more, but there was rarely enough. The wealthy worried about dwindling coal. The poor worried about thirst. One group wondered, how to keep their wine cellars stocked. The other scraped snow from gutters, prayed the melted trickle wouldn't sicken their families, and counted every sip as though it were gold. And sometimes water itself betrayed them. Ice clogged their chimneys and wells, cracking the stone. Buckets split apart from the frost, leaving families with nothing to carry water in even if they found it. Straw and cloth were stuffed into holes, patched with desperate hands, but still, water slipped away. Neighbors sometimes shared. One family with a stronger fire might melt extra snow and offer a cup to another. But just as often, the answer was silence. Not because people were cruel, but because they were afraid that giving water meant less for their own children. In a storm like that, mercy was a luxury. And yet, even in the darkest moments, people showed resilience. Children filled jars with snow, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them near the weak fire, letting them drip slowly overnight. Women collected icicles, hanging them inside to melt, drop by drop, into bowls. Every trick, every scrap of ingenuity bought them another day. We often think of water as simple. Turn a tap, and there it island. But in a Victorian snowstorm, water was a battle. Every sip was fought for with numb hands, every swallow carried risk, and every drop felt like life itself. If water was life, then fire was breath itself. In a Victorian snowstorm, no family could live without it. A fire gave light, cooked food, and above all, pushed back the cold that crept in through every crack of the wall. But survival with fire came at a heavy price, especially for the poor. Coal was the gold of winter. The wealthy bought it by the ton, stacking it in cellars until black heaps rose like hills. Servants fed fireplaces day and night, ensuring grand parlors glowed with steady warmth. Coal burned hot and clean, its smoke whisked away through tall chimneys. For them, the fire was constant, almost eternal. The poor, however, could rarely afford even a lump of coal. Their fires were fed with scraps of wood, broken chairs, bits of straw, or anything that would burn. Some even resorted to dried animal dung, desperate for a spark to keep frost from settling on their children's faces at night. These fuels did not burn clean. They smoldered, they hissed, and they filled the air with choking smoke. Imagine sitting in a single-room cottage. The walls are damp, the windows patched with rags, and the hearth is nothing but a pit of smoldering sticks. The fire keeps your children from freezing, but every breath they take is heavy with soot. Coughs echo through the room, deep rattling coughs that never seem to stop. Parents wave rags at the smoke, push shutters open a crack to let it out, but the moment they do, the wind blasts snow inside. It was a cruel choice. Choke on the smoke or freeze in the draft. Chimneys in poor homes were often nothing more than crooked stacks of stone. In storms, ice clogged them quickly. Smoke rolled back into the room, thick as fog. Ceilings blackened, walls dripped tar, and clothes reeked of ash that never washed out. Hair stank of smoke. Blankets carried its sour scent. The cottage itself became a chimney, and the family living inside its lungs. Children suffered most. Their small chests wheezed, their eyes streamed, and their throats burned raw. What began as a simple cough could spiral into something deadlier: pneumonia, consumption, tuberculosis. In a world without antibiotics, these were death sentences written in smoke. Parents sat awake through the night, listening to each shallow breath, fearing silence more than the storm outside. The elderly fared no better. Frail lungs collapsed quickly under the weight of soot. Many did not survive the long weeks of breathing in poison, their bodies too weak to fight both the cold and the smoke together. Even the strong bent beneath it. Headaches throbbed, eyes stung, and nights became restless battles to breathe. But no one dared let the fire die. Better to cough than to freeze. Better to suffer smoke than surrender to the storm clawing at the walls. And so the poor endured, lungs burning, eyes red, but alive. The wealthy, of course, faced smoke as well, but for them it was a nuisance, not a death sentence. Their tall chimneys vented properly. Their coal burned hot. Their servants brushed soot away before it built up. They complained of the smell but were never smothered by it. For the poor, smoke wasn't just an annoyance. It was a silent killer creeping through their homes every hour of every day. And when the coughs came, they came hard. First, just a tickle, then a hacking fit that rattled the ribs. Soon the fevers followed, soaking blankets with sweat that froze stiff in the night air. Children burned hot, their skin slick and clammy, only for the fever to turn cold and silent. Mothers pressed rags dipped in snow melt against their foreheads, whispering prayers, knowing little else could be done. Doctors were luxuries the poor could never dream of affording. A wealthy family might summon a physician with tonics and syrups, though even those cures rarely worked. The poor had only folk remedies, herbal teas brewed from dried leaves, poultices tied to the chest, whispered blessings over smoky fires. Sometimes they soothed, more often they failed. In these storms, illness spread house to house like the snow itself. Coughs echoed down alleys, across tenements, through whole neighborhoods, until it seemed the storm carried sickness on the wind. And in truth, it did, because the storm weakened everyone, stripped them bare, and left their bodies too fragile to fight back. To the poor, every ember in the hearth was both guardian and curse. A guardian because it held back the frost, a curse because it smothered them slowly in smoke. Yet no matter how heavy the air grew, no matter how raw their throats felt, no one dared let the fire go out. Because in a Victorian snowstorm, death by fire's smoke was always preferable to death by the storm's cold. And that was the terrible paradox. What saved them was also what destroyed them. If fire was the fragile heartbeat of every Victorian home, then the silence of a dead hearth was the sound of death itself. To wake in the middle of a snowstorm and realize the fire had gone out was one of the most terrifying moments a poor family could endure. The first clue wasn't sight, it was touch. Mothers stirred in the dark and reached for their children, only to find skin stiff and icy, little lips pale in the faint light. Fathers sat up, their breath visible in the air, and felt the weight of cold pressing on their chest like a stone. Blankets that once seemed heavy now crackled with frost. The fire was gone. There was no time to waste. A dead hearth was more dangerous than the storm outside. Parents scrambled, kneeling before a pile of gray ash, poking desperately for any ember that might still glow. If even a single coal remained alive, it could be coaxed back to flame. But if the ashes were cold, the options turned desperate. Matches were precious. Most families had only a few tucked away, sometimes a single box for an entire winter. To strike one was to gamble survival against scarcity. And kindling, always damp, always reluctant to catch. A dozen strikes might fail before one tiny flame appeared. In those long minutes, the cold crept in like a thief, stealing life from the youngest first. Imagine a mother striking flint in the dark, her hands trembling, sparks falling uselessly into damp twigs. She shields the feeble flame with her body, whispering to it like a prayer. Her children cry behind her, teeth chattering, while her husband rips apart a chair for wood. That single flame, fragile and flickering, decides whether the family will see morning. When kindling failed, there was only one option left: borrow fire. Neighbors knew this ritual well. A child or parent wrapped in rags would venture into the storm, clutching a clay pot lined with ash, hoping to beg a glowing coal from another hearth. The journey itself was torture. The wind tore at their clothes, snow blinded their eyes, and fingers stiffened until they could barely grip the pot. Many stumbled. Some never returned. But those who came back carried life in their hands. Families owed survival to these missions. A single coal carried across the snow could reignite a fire and save a house full of lives. To those who received it, that ember was more precious than bread, more valuable than gold. It was hope glowing faint in the darkness. But even when the fire burned, it demanded a keeper. Families quickly learned that survival meant vigilance. Someone had to stay awake, always. Nights were divided into shifts. Fathers and older sons sat bleary-eyed by the hearth, poking the coals, adding scraps of wood, watching flames rise and fall. Mothers took their turn, rocking infants with one hand while feeding the fire with the other. Even children too young for labor were sometimes drafted into watch duty, their tiny faces lit by orange glow as they fought against sleep. It was exhausting, but necessary. To fall asleep was to risk waking in silence, and silence could mean death. Parents often dozed lightly, ears tuned to the crackle of fire. The moment the sound grew faint, panic snapped them awake. Every decision became a calculation. Feed too much wood and waste tomorrow's supply. Feed too little and lose the flame before dawn. In cottages where fuel was scarce, the firekeeper's role became an art of restraint. Families learned to ration every twig, every strip of cloth, every splinter of broken furniture. The fire was kept alive not by abundance, but by skill and patience. Coals were banked beneath ash to smolder slowly, stretched thin until morning. Parents whispered to children, "Don't let it die. Whatever you do, don't let it die." And yet, fires still failed, sometimes because of exhaustion, sometimes because of miscalculation, sometimes because the storm's draft sucked the flame away. Those were the nights that etched scars into memory. Families huddled together, teeth chattering, praying dawn would come quickly enough. Many did not survive until morning. Even the wealthy were not immune to this fear, though their version was softened by luxury. Their servants rotated through the night, tending multiple hearths, hauling coal from cellars, and stirring coals until their masters awoke to warmth. But even in those grand homes, the sudden silence of a dead fireplace could bring unease. It was a reminder that beneath the velvet curtains and polished wood, they too were at the mercy of the storm's power. For the poor, however, firekeeping was not just a duty, it was a matter of love. Parents guarded flames as if guarding their children. Children learned to cradle embers like treasures. Whole families organized their nights around the rhythm of fire, because fire was more than heat, it was survival itself. And in the endless nights of a Victorian snowstorm, when the wind roared through alleys and snow pressed against doors, survival meant this: never letting the fire stand alone. Tonight we move deeper into the storm, into a place where the enemy wasn't only outside, but already inside the frost that crawled across walls, windows, and even blankets. Windows were meant to keep families safe, to separate the fragile warmth of a room from the merciless cold outside. But in the Victorian age, they were often the weakest point in a home's defense. Wealthy households had glass panes, thick curtains, and servants to hang heavy cloth against the drafts. Poor families, though, had nothing but rags, paper, or wooden shutters nailed over crude frames. By day, frost painted lace-like patterns across the glass. Beautiful, but cruel. Children traced them with their fingertips, laughing softly before mothers pulled their hands away. Every touch was another bite of cold seeping deeper into their skin. By night, those same patterns grew thicker, turning windows into shimmering sheets of ice. Families woke to find frost not just on the panes, but spreading across the walls, settling into corners, and even dusting the edges of straw beds. Imagine opening your eyes in the morning and seeing a thin layer of ice glittering on the inside of your cottage, sparkling in the dim glow of a dying fire. The air so sharp it stabbed the lungs, the blankets so stiff with frost they cracked when pulled. That was reality for the poor. Their homes weren't sanctuaries, they were cages where the storm pressed its claws straight through the walls. The wealthy fought back with layers. Velvet, curtains were pulled shut, carpets hung over walls, extra fabric nailed around frames. Parlors and drawing rooms with grand windows were abandoned entirely, sealed off to conserve fuel. Families retreated to smaller spaces, clustering around the largest fireplaces, leaving rooms dark and frozen behind them. Still, the frost came. It crept past curtains, etched itself into corners, whispered against the glass like a warning. For the poor, defenses fell quickly. Paper stiffened, tore, and curled away from window frames. Cloth coverings froze solid, crackling like brittle bark when touched. Some families hammered rags directly onto the wood, plunging rooms into darkness even during the day. Children sat in near night, squinting at the faint glow of a single candle, while outside the storm howled. Isolation came at a cost. With windows sealed, daylight vanished. Days and nights blended together into a blur of darkness, smoke, and frost. Families lost all sense of time, measuring hours only by the dwindling pile of wood or the hollow growl of empty stomach. The storm robbed them not only of warmth, but of rhythm, of hope tied to the sun's cycle. And still, the frost became part of the household. It clung to blankets, settled on clothing, and turned every surface into an enemy. Parents wrapped children tighter, only to find their own breath freezing on cloth, leaving crystals that sparkled in firelight. The storm didn't need to break down the door, it was already inside, curled beneath the rafters, gnawing at the walls, whispering, "You cannot keep me out." Neighbors knew this truth too. In some districts, when homes grew too cold, families abandoned their own rooms to crowd into a neighbor's space, where at least one fire still burned. Privacy disappeared. 10 or more people might huddle together in one smoky room, bodies pressed close, children sleeping against strangers. The air was stifling, rank with sweat and smoke, but better suffocating warmth than silent frost. Sometimes these gatherings grew larger, spilling into courtyards or alleys where scraps of wood were piled into a single fire for everyone to share. A community blaze became the heart of survival. Men fed it with kindling, women rocked infants in the glow, children stretched small hands toward its warmth. Around those fires, stories were told, songs whispered, prayers lifted into the night sky. It wasn't just about heat, it was about defiance. Together, families could push back the storm, if only for a few hours. But even community fires were fragile. Sparks leapt into the dark, smoke curled into the storm, and everyone knew the blaze would eventually consume all it was given. Fear lingered in every face. What happens when there is nothing left to burn? Sometimes fights broke out over wood, accusations of hoarding, arguments over who had given enough. Other times, silence fell, each person staring into the flames as if trying to memorize their glow, storing its image for the moment it would be gone. The frost always returned. It clung to walls like an intruder, pressed against windows like a ghost, whispered in every creak of the house. To the wealthy, frost was a nuisance. To the poor, it was a death sentence waiting to be claimed. And so families prayed, sang, and clung together, not because it banished the frost, but because it reminded them they were not alone. In the end, frost became more than ice. It was a symbol, a reminder that the storm was not just outside, but everywhere in the walls, in their beds, in their lungs. And still, even in the shimmer of frost on their windows, families found reasons to endure. A child's laugh at a frozen pattern, a neighbor's gift of one glowing coal, a ragged quilt heavy with love. Those small victories mattered, because they proved that even when the storm crawled into every corner, the human spirit still refused to surrender. So, let's move from the frost on the windows to something even more relentless. Something that gnawed not just at walls, but at the very core of every family trapped in the storm hunger. Food in Victorian Britain was never abundant for the poor, even on good days. Most families scraped by with bread, potatoes, maybe a bit of salted fish or broth if fortune allowed. When a snowstorm shut down streets, markets, and bakeries, survival wasn't just about keeping warm anymore. It became about stretching every crumb into a lifeline. At first, families tried to ration. Bread was sliced thinner than ever before. Each crust softened in boiling water, so it could be shared between several mouths. Bones, often saved from weeks before, were pulled back from the larder and boiled again and again until they gave up their last trace of flavor. Parents convinced themselves the storm would pass quickly. "Just a few days," they whispered. "We only need to make it until the road's clear." But the snow didn't stop, and cupboards that were half empty at the start grew bare within days. Hunger crept into the cottages like a second storm. Imagine being a parent, staring at your children as they cried themselves to sleep with hollow bellies. You had nothing left to give, so you tore scraps from the fields, nettles, dandelion leaves, even bark stripped from trees, and boiled them into thin, bitter soup. It wasn't food, not really, but it kept the body moving one more day. Mothers often gave up their own portions, pretending they had eaten already. Fathers returned from desperate searches, empty-handed, their faces gray with guilt. Grandparents sometimes lied, saying they weren't hungry. pushing bowls toward younger hands while their own strength quietly faded away. Sacrifice was constant, silent, and heartbreaking. The wealthy, meanwhile, still had something to eat. They had pantries with salted meats, dried beans, jars of pickled vegetables. But even in mansions, unease grew. Servants were told to cut meat thinner, to stretch flour further, to water down soups. The rich grew bored with repetitive meals, while the poor starved in shadows only streets away. The contrast was brutal. For the poorest, hunger changed the very rhythm of life. Families went to bed earlier, not from fatigue, but to silence the growl in their stomachs. Children were told bedtime stories not to entertain them, but to distract them from pain. Hunger made people lightheaded, too weak to chop wood or fetch water. Even gathering fuel became impossible, when your legs could barely carry you across the room. And yet, hunger also sparked a kind of grim creativity. Families preserved what little they had with almost ritual precision. Fat from cooking was collected in jars and smeared on bread in the thinnest layer imaginable. Vegetable peels and onion skins, things we'd throw away without thought today, were boiled into stews. Even crumbs swept from the table were saved, pressed together with broth, and eaten as though they were a meal. The rituals of food became symbols of hope. Families still tried to eat together, even if dinner was nothing more than watery broth shared from one pot. They sat in silence, breathing in steam, pretending for a moment that it was enough. Parents ate last, children first, because the youngest were the most fragile. Every bite was a decision. Who gets to be stronger tomorrow? But hunger doesn't only weaken bodies, it frays relationships. Neighbors who once shared bread grew suspicious, whispering about who might be hiding food. Fights broke out in alleys over scraps. Some hoarded what little they had, while others shared and risked starvation themselves. Hunger tested not just the stomach, but the spirit. Yet even in that bleakness, moments of grace shone through. A neighbor giving half a loaf to another family. A child slipping a piece of potato into a sibling's hand. Elders telling stories around the fire, so the little ones could forget, even briefly, the emptiness in their bellies. These small acts were as nourishing as food itself, proof that even in starvation, humanity clung to compassion. As days dragged into weeks, hunger left marks you could see. Children's cheeks hollowed, their voices softened into whispers. Elders grew frail and quiet. Even the strongest men staggered, their eyes dull with exhaustion. In churchyards, tiny graves multiplied, stark reminders of how thin the line between survival and loss had become. Hunger was more than an absence of food. It was an enemy, invisible but relentless, pressing just as hard as the storm outside. Every meal was a battle won, every bite of bread a small victory. And still, through determination, sacrifice, and sheer stubborn will, many endured. Because in the end, hunger could not extinguish hope. As long as families clung together, shared what they had, and refused to surrender, the storm could gnaw at their bones but not break their spirit. And that, perhaps, was the greatest act of defiance of all. In the last part we talked about hunger, but let's turn to something even more ironic and cruel: thirst. Imagine being surrounded by snow as far as the eye could see, and yet having no safe water to drink. That was the reality for families trapped in a Victorian snowstorm. Wells froze solid, pumps seized up, rivers and streams that once flowed through the countryside became hard ribbons of ice. Water, the most basic need of life, suddenly became as scarce as bread. And for the poor, who had little fuel to spare, melting snow was a punishing chore. Families would scoop baskets of snow and dump them into pots on the hearth. But snow is deceptive. A bucket packed to the brim shrinks down into a few mouthfuls when it melts. Children carried sack after sack, their arms raw, their clothes soaked and frozen stiff, only to bring home enough liquid for a single cup of weak broth. And snow wasn't clean. It carried soot from chimneys, dirt from the streets, even disease. To drink it safely meant boiling, but boiling needed firewood or coal, luxuries the poor often didn't have. Many had no choice but to sip the dirty melt, hoping it wouldn't bring sickness on top of everything else. For some, desperation drove them to dangerous places. Men hacked through river ice with picks and hammers, striking until the black water below revealed itself. One slip meant plunging into freezing depths, a death sentence in seconds. Still they went, because thirst didn't care about fear. It demanded risk. Indoors, water was rationed like gold. Mothers poured it carefully, just enough to soften stale bread or mix with a handful of oats. Children begged for more, but bowls stayed shallow. Parents often gave up their share so the youngest could drink. And when the pots ran dry, the silence in the room was louder than the storm outside. The wealthy, of course, had servants to fetch ice and melt it over roaring coal fires. Their kitchens had basins of clean water, even during the worst nights. But even they felt the strain, complaining when baths had to wait or when wine was watered down more than usual. Meanwhile, the poor risked their lives for a sip. Some tried to stretch water with beer or ale. Small ale, weak, watered-down brew was consumed by children and adults alike. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival. The calories and faint sugars helped more than plain snow water ever could. But when even ale ran out, the poor went back to scraping snow from alleys, melting it in smoke-filled rooms, and praying it wouldn't poison them. Thirst did more than dry the throat. It stole strength. Without enough water, bodies weakened faster. Fevers burned hotter. Coughs rattled deeper. Even small tasks became unbearable when lips cracked and tongues swelled. Hunger gnawed, but thirst screamed. And yet, just like with food, families found ways to endure. Some lined clay pots with ash, keeping coals inside to carry warmth to neighbors who had no fire, so those neighbors could melt their own snow. Others shared a single bucket between households, sipping from it slowly as though it were sacred. In that silence, water became more than drink. It was community, survival, even faith. Think of a child in those nights. Their small hands cupped around a tin mug, steam rising from a trickle of melted snow. They took slow sips, their eyes closing in relief, as though that tiny portion was a feast. And parents watched, shoulders sagging with gratitude, because for one more night, thirst had been held at bay. Water was never plentiful, never certain, but every drop mattered. Every trickle was a victory. And when spring finally came and rivers ran free again, survivors never looked at water the same way. They knew its price. They had fought for it with their hands, their breath, their very lives. In the Victorian storm, thirst was as merciless as hunger, but it also revealed something deeper. That survival is not just about what you have, it's about how fiercely you protect it, how carefully you share it, and how much you're willing to endure for one more drop. If you've stayed with me through this journey so far, you already know that in a Victorian snowstorm, fire wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. But here's the cruel twist. The very flames that kept families alive also poisoned them slowly, filling their homes with thick smoke that clung to every breath. For wealthy households, coal burned hot and clean in tall chimneys. Servants kept the flues clear, and smoke whisked away into the sky. But for the poor, coal was a luxury. Most couldn't afford even a handful. Instead, they fed their fires with scraps, damp wood pulled from alleys, straw from bedding, even dried animal dung when nothing else remained. These didn't burn clean. They smoldered, choked, and hissed, filling cottages with a haze so dense that you could barely see the opposite wall. Imagine a one-room tenement. The fire sputters in the hearth, weak but stubborn. Parents huddle, their children close to it, knowing it's the only thing keeping frostbite away. Yet with every breath, their lungs fill with soot. Children cough endlessly, their small chests rattling. The elderly wheeze, each inhale shallow and painful. Even the strongest feel headaches pounding in their skulls, their eyes stinging as smoke curls around them like a second storm inside their walls. And there was no real escape. Chimneys in poor cottages were little more than crooked stacks of stone, often cracked or clogged with soot and ice. When blocked, the smoke rolled back into the room like a black tide. Families tried waving rags or opening small gaps in the shutters, but the moment they did, icy wind and snow rushed in, stealing the warmth they had fought so hard to keep. It was a brutal choice: breathe the smoke or invite the cold. The very walls of these homes told the story. They blackened with soot, ceilings dripped with tar. Clothes hung on pegs reeked of smoke, their fibers permanently stained. Hair smelled of ash. Blankets carried the stench of burned rags. No amount of scrubbing could erase it. Families themselves became part of the chimney, their lungs the filter for a fire that refused to burn clean. And yet, no one dared let the flames go out. Better to cough and choke than to freeze. Parents whispered this bitter truth to one another in the dark. Better the slow enemy than the fast one. But smoke was only the beginning. In that damp, choking air, sickness thrived. What started as a tickle in the throat often grew into something far worse. Without medicine, without antibiotics, a simple cough could spiral into pneumonia. Consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, spread easily in those cramped, smoky rooms. Children were the first to fall. Already weakened by hunger, their small bodies had no defense. Parents listened through the night to their shallow breaths, each wheeze a warning that death might already be sitting in the room with them. Elders followed, quickly, their frail lungs no match for the combination of smoke, damp, and cold. Folk remedies became their only hope. Mothers brewed teas from dried herbs, wrapping warm cloths around sick chests. Fathers prayed over their children, begging for the fever to break. Some pressed onions or mustard poultices to the skin, hoping to draw out illness. At times, these small efforts soothed, but rarely did they cure. The wealthy called for doctors, though even then, medicine was limited. Tonics, syrups, or leeches might be prescribed, but for the poor there was no such help. Only prayers, whispers, and the stubborn will to keep going. And often, it wasn't enough. Entire families lost children to the silent cough, and churchyards filled with small graves marked only by wooden crosses. And yet even in these choking, smoke-filled rooms, resilience flickered. Parents kept tending the fire, no matter how much it hurt to breathe. Children laughed between coughing fits, tracing patterns in the soot on the walls. Families endured because they had no other choice. The fire was both enemy and ally, and every ember represented both suffering and survival. When you think about it, that's the brutal paradox of life in a Victorian snowstorm. What saved you could also destroy you. The poor didn't choose between health and comfort. They chose between life and death every single day, with every lungful of smoke they swallowed. So the next time you see a cozy fire and take its warmth for granted, remember them, the families who guarded their flames through nights of choking haze, who endured the poison of their own survival, and who kept living because they refused to let the cold win. Let me take you into the darkest moment of a Victorian snowstorm, the night the fire died. If you've followed the story so far, you know that every ember was life itself. So imagine what it meant to wake up in the middle of the night to silence, no crackle, no glow, only cold pressing in like an iron weight. The first clue wasn't sight, it was touch. Blanket stiff with frost, breath freezing before it left your lips. Mothers reaching for their children only to find them shivering violently, skin icy as stone. Fathers stumbling half asleep toward the hearth, praying that a faint orange glow still lingered under the ash. Sometimes there was nothing left. The embers were cold, lifeless gray. Relighting a fire in the middle of a storm was an ordeal of pure desperation. Matches were rare and expensive, rationed like food. Flint and steel demanded steady hands and dry kindling, two luxuries few had. And in a snowstorm, nothing was truly dry. Families kept a small pile of tinder hidden away, scraps of paper, curls of wood shavings, even pieces of cloth torn from old shirts. These were guarded like treasure, because one failed attempt at relighting could mean hours in the freezing dark. Parents struck sparks again and again, their fingers trembling, their children huddled behind them, whispering silent prayers that one spark would catch. If the hearth could not be relit, there was only one option left: to beg for fire from a neighbor. Picture it, someone wrapping themselves in rags, carrying a clay pot or iron pan, and stepping into the storm with nothing but hope. They would trudge through blinding snow, shield a single glowing coal beneath layers of ash and cloth, and pray it survived the journey home. Many families owed their lives to such midnight missions. Others never returned, their bodies found stiff and pale in snowdrifts days later. The wealthy rarely faced this terror. Their servants tended fires through the night, feeding coal until the hearths roared. But even in mansions, accidents happened. Fires went out unexpectedly, and the sudden chill reminded everyone, rich or poor, that without flame, death waited patiently just outside the walls. To prevent disaster, poor families invented their own rhythm of survival. Sleeping in shifts. Someone always had to stay awake. Fathers sat near the hearth, eyes heavy, feeding twigs to keep the flames alive. Mothers shook their children awake when it was their turn, teaching them responsibility far too young. Small faces lit by the glow of embers fought to stay awake, nodding off until a parent shook them gently. Childhood, in those nights, was stolen by duty. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and restless. Parents dozed with one ear open, listening for the dreaded silence the moment the fire whispered its last breath. Even in their dreams, fear lingered. A nightmare of waking to frozen children, of roofs collapsing under snow, of death slipping through the cracks in the walls. The wealthy practiced their own version of this system. Servants rotated duties, walking barefoot across icy floors with heavy coal scuttles, stirring the fire so their masters could sleep soundly in feather beds. Even for them, though, it was exhausting. By morning, eyes burned red from smoke and fatigue, hands blistered from hauling coal in the dark. And yet, despite the exhaustion, this constant vigil was non-negotiable. In a Victorian snowstorm, time itself became an enemy. Every hour without fire brought the cold closer. Every minute of negligence risked a death that could not be undone. Imagine a child shaking their mother awake at 2 a.m, whispering, "It's dying." Together they rush to coax a spark, blowing softly into the embers until smoke rises and a faint flame returns. That moment, the relief of seeing fire flicker back to life was salvation. Families celebrated quietly, not with cheers but with tears, knowing they had bought themselves another day. Because in the end, keeping a fire alive wasn't just a chore, it was a battle against exhaustion, against hunger, against despair. And every family, rich or poor, knew that if they lost that battle, the storm outside would claim them before morning. That's why survival in a Victorian snowstorm was never about comfort. It was about vigilance. It was about refusing to close your eyes completely, about guarding life itself in the fragile glow of a hearth that could never be left alone. Let's move deeper into this storm, because keeping a fire alive was only half the fight. The other enemy was everywhere, pressing against glass, seeping through shutters, and creeping across the walls. Frost. In wealthy homes, windows stood tall and proud, framed in heavy velvet curtains. Servants were ordered to hang extra cloth, even rugs or carpets against the walls, trying to trap heat inside. Yet even then, frost worked its way in. At dawn, grand parlors glistened with icy lace across glass panes, beautiful to the eye, but bitter to the touch. Entire rooms were abandoned, sealed off from use because no amount of coal could keep them warm. Families huddled in 2 or 3 chambers, while the rest of the house stood frozen and silent, proof that even wealth could not command nature to yield. For the poor, the story was harsher. Many didn't have glass at all. Their windows were patched with paper, with scraps of cloth nailed across wooden frames. Storm winds shredded these barriers in hours. Paper stiffened and cracked under the weight of frost. Cloth froze solid, crumbling when touched. Some families nailed rags directly over the frames, sealing themselves in darkness, their rooms lit only by the sputter of a fire. Day and night blurred together inside these shadowy prisons. Children sometimes woke to find ice on the inside walls, sparkling faintly in candlelight. They would trace patterns with their fingers, giggling until their mothers pulled them away, scolding softly. They knew what children did not, that every mark meant cold stealing deeper into their bones. The frost wasn't a visitor outside. It had moved in, coating walls, stiffening bedding, and crawling into the very blankets meant to protect them. Sleeping against an exterior wall was a gamble. The icy breath of winter seeped through the boards until skin blistered. Many families shifted their bedding into the center of the room, piling together like islands of resistance against a tide of ice. Yet even then, the frost followed. Blankets hung near the walls froze stiff. Shoes left too close to the window turned solid overnight, impossible to bend or wear. The wealthy managed by shrinking their world. Heavy curtains drawn, parlors closed, children told to stay in upper chambers where fireplaces burned brighter. But the poor had no such luxury. Their homes weren't sealed fortresses. They were sieves. Every gust of wind whistled through cracks. Every snowflake seemed determined to join them indoors. Parents stuffed newspapers and straw into gaps, only to hear the wind rattle them loose within hours. At times, the frost felt alive. Families whispered that it wanted in, that it clawed at the seams of their homes. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Snow sifted through thatched roofs and fell in white heaps onto beds. Ice crept along beams until wood cracked from the strain. Shutters rattled like drums in the night, reminding every ear that no wall could hold winter out forever. Isolation became the cruelest price. Windows sealed with rags cut off even the faint light the storm allowed. Rooms sank into shadow where fire barely reached. Families lost track of time, unsure whether morning had come or if it was still night. Children asked again and again why the sun no longer entered their homes. Parents had no answer except to tell them to stay close to the fire. And yet, there was no choice. Because to leave windows open, even a crack, was to invite death. It was the same cruel decision faced again and again during the storm. Breathe smoke, or breathe frost. Live with darkness, or let the cold through. There were no good choices, only desperate ones. Some families tried to beat the frost with creativity. Ropes were strung across rooms, blankets hung like walls inside, creating smaller spaces easier to heat. Beds were piled into corners, straw stuffed thick under bodies to insulate them from frozen floors. Every measure helped a little, but nothing stopped the frost completely. It was a predator, too patient to be shut out. For the wealthy, frost was decoration. They admired the lace-like patterns, even called them winter's art. For the poor, frost was invasion. It meant damp bedding, frozen bread, and breath that hung in the air like ghosts. It whispered into every ear, reminding them that their homes were not fortresses, but cages with walls that betrayed them. Tonight, let's step outside those freezing cottages and into the heart of the streets, because survival in a Victorian snowstorm wasn't always fought alone. When the winds howled loudest and fires sputtered out, something remarkable happened. Neighbors turned to each other. Out of desperation came one of the most powerful weapons against the cold, the community fire. Picture an alley in London or Manchester, buried knee-deep in snow, houses shivering in silence. Families one by one step outside, clutching splinters of wood, a half-burned log, maybe a lump of coal they had been saving. On their own, these scraps were almost worthless, barely enough to keep a hearth alive for an hour, but piled together in the center of the street, they became something greater, a blaze, a shared heartbeat against the storm. The glow pulled people in. Mothers wrapped in shawls pressed infants against their chests. Children held out their hands, their fingers raw but eager for even a flicker of warmth. Men leaned close, feeding the flames with crates broken apart, sticks scavenged from fences, and scraps torn from their own cottages. The fire roared, and for a few hours, the storm was pushed back. It wasn't just heat. Around that fire, spirits lifted. Someone told a story of winters past, Another sang a hymn in a wavering voice, and soon the whole circle joined in. Smoke curled into the stormy night, carrying laughter and sorrow together. For those moments, survival wasn't silent suffering, it was community. Of course, unity didn't erase fear. Every family knew that once the fuel was gone, the fire would shrink and die. They watched the flames anxiously, measuring them with the same worry they used to count bread crusts. When sparks flew upward, children cheered. When embers dimmed, silence fell heavy. And sometimes arguments broke out. One neighbor accused another of holding back wood. Another whispered that so-and-so had coal hidden at home but refused to share. Desperation makes suspicion grow fast. But even with shadows, the fire mattered. It was proof that in the harshest storm, people chose to stand together. A single blaze became the heart of a street, a village, sometimes an entire neighborhood. When families finally trudged back into their cottages, they carried with them not only the memory of warmth, but the reminder that they were not entirely alone in their suffering. Animals were often part of these gatherings too. Dogs curled near the edge of the fire, their fur singed at the tips. A goat tethered nearby stamped its hooves on the frozen ground, steam rising from its nostrils. Even livestock lent their presence, and in that mingling of man and beast, the fire seemed to grow stronger, as though every living body added fuel. The wealthy rarely needed such things. Their fires burned behind high walls, tended by servants. But in the poorest districts, the community fire became a ritual of survival. It wasn't charity. It wasn't comfort. It was defiance. Against frost, against hunger, against the storm itself. Think about that for a moment. Each ember in that blaze carried sacrifice. Someone gave up a chair leg. Someone else burned the last piece of wood they had been saving. Every flame was lit with desperation, but also with trust. Trust that the fire would be enough, that neighbors wouldn't let it die too soon. And when the storm finally broke, when roofs dripped and the world thawed, the memory of those fires lingered. People spoke of nights huddled shoulder to shoulder, of the songs that carried them through, of the way the firelight painted every face in orange and gold. The blaze itself turned to ash, but the bond forged around it stayed. The community fire was more than survival. It was resistance, a refusal to let the cold isolate and destroy. It was a reminder that no matter how poor, how desperate, people could still create warmth together, and that gathering scraps to make something bigger than themselves was perhaps the most human act of all. Let's move closer to the heart of survival, because if the cold didn't break you during a Victorian snowstorm, hunger surely tried. Fire could be coaxed back to life, blankets could be patched from rags, but when food was gone, there was nothing left but gnawing emptiness, and that emptiness was merciless. At first, families rationed carefully. A loaf of bread was sliced thinner each day, potatoes stretched with water until they became more broth than food. Parents told their children, "Don't worry, tomorrow will be better," even as they knew tomorrow's cupboard would be emptier than today's. Within days, the poor faced bare shelves. Meat was almost never in their homes to begin with. What they did have were scraps, bones saved from past meals, a heel of bread, maybe a shriveled onion. Those bones were boiled again and again until the pot yielded nothing but cloudy water. Still, they served it with solemnity, because even the ghost of a meal was better than nothing. Bread crusts too hard to chew were softened in hot water and passed to children as if they were treasures. Mothers sometimes took the smallest bites themselves, just enough to keep from fainting, while slipping the rest to their little ones. Fathers searched snow-choked streets for scraps behind bakeries, prying through frozen bins with numb fingers, hoping for anything edible. Sometimes they returned with nothing but shame in their eyes. When desperation deepened, families turned to the earth itself. Nettles and weeds were pulled from beneath melting patches of snow. Bitter herbs were boiled into thin stews. Bark was scraped from trees and chewed for the faint sweetness of sap. It wasn't nourishment, it was survival theater, a way to quiet the stomach for a few more hours. The cruelty of hunger showed itself in children first. Their cheeks hollowed, their voices grew weak, their laughter faded into quiet whimpers. Parents tucked them into bed early, whispering bedtime stories not to entertain them but to distract them from the emptiness gnawing at their bellies. And when a child coughed through the night, thin and frail, the room fell silent. Everyone knew hunger had made their little bodies too fragile to fight disease. The elderly suffered next. Many gave up their portions without argument, insisting, "I'm not hungry. Give it to the young." It was a lie spoken with love. Their strength faded quickly, and sometimes they slipped away quietly, leaving families to mourn without even the energy for tears. But hunger also revealed a strange kind of heroism. Fathers would break their own bread in half and hand it silently to their children. Mothers would stir broth with nothing in it but water and ashes, yet serve it with a smile, as though it were a feast. Neighbors who had almost nothing sometimes shared a crust or a potato, because they knew what it meant to hear your child say, "I'm hungry," and have no answer. The wealthy experienced hunger in a different shade. Their meals shrank from roasts and pastries to broths and salted meat. They spoke of inconvenience, of boredom with plain food, while the poor spoke of starvation. The divide was stark. In grand kitchens, servants rationed portions, careful to make supplies last until deliveries resumed. In cottages, there was no rationing, there was simply nothing. And yet, even in this darkness, the human spirit fought back. Families created rituals around meals, no matter how meager. A single crust was broken and shared like communion. A pot of thin stew was ladled out slowly, each spoonful given weight and meaning. Mealtime became less about feeding the body and more about feeding hope. Some parents sacrificed themselves openly. Others did it in silence, pretending they had eaten earlier, insisting they were full. Their children never knew until later in life that their survival had been bought with those small, quiet acts of love. And when the storm finally broke, when the thaw revealed the earth again, hunger's toll was written everywhere. Children staggered weakly into the sunlight. Elders did not rise at all. Churchyards filled with small graves. Yet those who survived carried with them not just scars, but lessons never again to take bread for granted, never again to see a full cupboard without gratitude. Because in the Victorian snowstorm, hunger was not simply the absence of food. It was the presence of despair, testing how much love, sacrifice, and determination a family could hold before breaking. And for many, that love was the only reason anyone made it through. Let's step deeper into another battle Victorians had to fight in those merciless snowstorms. We've talked about hunger, but there's something we often overlook: water. You'd think With snow falling endlessly from the sky, there would be no shortage. But in the Victorian age, snow wasn't a gift. It was a cruel trick. Water was everywhere, but almost impossible to drink. The first sign of trouble came when wells froze solid at the surface. The pumps seized up, iron handles stiff with frost. Streams that once ran freely through the countryside were locked under shining sheets of ice. Buckets cracked in the cold, and when you hauled one up, it came heavy with ice instead of water. Families who had always trusted their wells now found themselves staring into black holes sealed by winter's grip. The wealthy, as always, had options. Servants hacked ice from ponds or cut through frozen wells, hauling it indoors to melt over blazing coal fires. Water was available, but every pot boiled came at the cost of dwindling fuel. A bucket of ice might yield only a trickle of water, and keeping that trickle flowing meant burning coal that could otherwise heat a room. Even for them, thirst became a quiet anxiety. For the poor, the struggle was brutal. With fires already weak and fuel precious, melting snow was a punishing chore. Children were often sent out with baskets or sacks, trudging through drifts with numb hands, scooping snow into pots. They would set the pots by the hearth, watching the white heaps shrink down into only a few mouthfuls of liquid. Imagine that a bucket full of snow melting into less than a cup of water. Families repeated this process again and again, each trip outside more exhausting than the last. And melted snow wasn't always safe. It carried soot, dirt, even disease from the filthy streets where horses dropped waste and people dumped refuse. Without boiling, it could make an already starving body sicker. But boiling demanded wood or coal, luxuries the poor rarely had. So many simply drank the snowmelt as it was, trading safety for survival, praying the storm would end before illness claimed them. In villages and towns, men risked their lives to break through frozen rivers. They struck at the ice with hammers, picks, or even bare stones, desperate to reach the black water beneath. The work was dangerous. Ice cracked underfoot, sending shivers through the surface. One slip, one plunge into that water, and death was almost guaranteed within minutes. Still they went, because thirst did not wait. A single bucket of river water, carried back through howling winds, might keep a family alive another night. Inside those fragile cottages, water became as precious as bread. Mothers rationed it carefully, pouring just enough to soften crusts of bread or to stretch a handful of oats into porridge. Children begged for more, their lips cracked, but the bowls stayed shallow. Fathers dipped cloths into melted snow to wipe their children's faces, not for cleanliness, but for comfort, whispering that spring would bring rivers flowing again. For those who lived near city pumps or fountains, the storm turned them into battlegrounds. Neighbors crowded around, hacking ice and filling buckets, while fights sometimes broke out over who would take the last scoop of unfrozen water. People guarded what they carried home like treasure, shielding buckets from the wind as though they held gold. And then there were the poorest of the poor, the ones who had no bucket, no axe, no fire to melt snow. They knelt in the street and ate handfuls of snow directly, their lips burning from the cold, their bellies aching from the shock. Children did it most, stuffing snow into their mouths, only to be scolded by parents who knew it brought more harm than relief. Eating snow dropped the body's temperature even further, but for a thirsty child, it was impossible to resist. Water in those storms was more than thirst. It was exhaustion. It was danger. It was a reminder that even the most basic element of life could turn against you when winter closed its fist. The wealthy had coal fires to melt ice, but feared their supplies would run out. The poor had only their hands, their breath, and their stubborn will to scoop snow again and again, turning white drifts into thin, liquid hope. And when the storm finally broke, when rivers began to thaw and wells loosened their icy grip, the sound of dripping water was like music. For the poor, it was a victory almost as sweet as bread. A reminder that even when nature seems determined to deny you life itself, there is always one more way to fight, one more day to endure. Let's move from water to something just as critical: fire. We've already seen how every ember meant survival. But in a Victorian snowstorm, fire was never just a blessing. For the poor, it was also a curse. Because while flames gave light and warmth, the smoke could slowly strangle an entire family inside their own home. Here's the reality. Coal, when burned properly, gave off strong, hot flames with relatively little smoke. The wealthy stocked their cellars with it, keeping their fireplaces glowing. But the poor could rarely afford coal. Instead, they burned whatever they could find: damp wood scavenged from alleys, straw stripped from bedding, even dried animal dung. These fuels didn't burn clean. They smoldered, filling cottages with thick, acrid smoke that clung to every surface. Picture a family huddled close to the hearth, eyes watering, chests rattling with coughs. The flames keep the frost away, but the air is so heavy with soot that every breath feels like inhaling poison. Children cough until their ribs ache. The elderly wheeze in the smoky haze, their lungs too frail to fight. And still, nobody dares to snuff the fire out, because without it, the cold would kill faster than the smoke. The chimneys in those poor cottages were barely worthy of the name. Often they were nothing more than crooked holes hacked into walls, patched together with loose bricks or stone. Soot and ice clogged them easily. And when that happened, the smoke had nowhere to go. It rolled back inside, black clouds billowing across ceilings until the entire room looked like the inside of a chimney. Families tried waving rags to push it toward cracks in the shutters, but those cracks also let the cold tear in. So it was always a choice: choke on smoke or freeze in silence, and the smoke left its mark. The whitewashed walls turned black. The ceilings dripped with tar. Clothes carried the stench long after the storm passed. Even skin and hair were stained with soot. No amount of scrubbing ever fully removed it. The house itself seemed to become part of the fire, breathing and coughing along with the people trapped inside. Doctors at the time knew little about respiratory disease, and medicine was out of reach for the poor anyway. So a cough that started as irritation from smoke often deepened into something deadly: pneumonia, bronchitis, or the dreaded tuberculosis, which Victorians called consumption. One child's wheeze at night could spread despair through the entire household, because everyone knew it might be the beginning of the end. Mothers tried folk remedies: herbal teas brewed from whatever dried leaves they had, poultices pressed against the chest, prayers whispered in the smoky dark. Sometimes it eased the suffering. Most times it didn't. And when fever set in, when the cough rattled endlessly, there was little left to do but hope. The wealthy, of course, lived differently. Their tall chimneys carried smoke far above the rooftops, swept away by the wind. Their fires burned hotter, cleaner, fueled by the black gold of coal. For, to them, smoke was an annoyance at worst, a bit of soot on the hearthstone, or the need for a chimney sweep. But for the poor, smoke was a second storm inside the house, invisible, but just as deadly as the snow outside. Imagine the cruel irony. You keep the fire alive so your family doesn't freeze, but in doing so, you fill your home with the very thing that steals your breath. Each night, children fell asleep coughing, their dreams broken by hacking fits. Parents sat awake, listening to the rasp of their loved ones, knowing they had no choice but to endure it. Survival, once again, demanded suffering. And still, families fought to keep that fire burning. They prodded the embers with sticks, fed it scraps of damp wood, whispered to it like it was alive. Because no matter how much the smoke stung their lungs, no one was willing to face the silence of a dead hearth. In the end, the poor learned a bitter truth, that even the very thing keeping them alive could also be the slow killer within their walls. But if you think this was the worst of it, wait until you hear what happened when the fire finally died out. Because in those moments, silence and cold crept in together, and the fight for survival reached its most desperate point. If you've followed the story so far, you already know that smoke-filled cottages were deadly traps. But let's look closer at what often followed the cough. Not just any cough, but the kind that began quietly, like a tickle in the throat, and ended as a sentence of death. For poor families in a Victorian snowstorm, sickness was always lurking. The cold crept into their bones, the damp soaked into their straw bedding, and the smoke filled their lungs. It was the perfect storm for disease. A child might start with a small cough at night. Parents brushed it off, hoping it would fade by morning. But in the smoky, freezing air, that cough grew deeper, harsher, until the whole room echoed with it. Medicine was not on their side. There were no antibiotics, no real treatments that could cure pneumonia or tuberculosis. For the wealthy, doctors might arrive with syrups or tonics, maybe even leeches or herbal remedies, but these were often little more than placebos. For the poor, doctors were a dream they couldn't afford. Instead, they turned to what little they had: herbs steeped into weak teas, poultices pressed to the chest, whispered prayers to saints. Mothers stayed awake through the night, laying damp cloths on their children's foreheads, begging heaven for mercy. But disease did not care for prayer. It thrived in those smoky cottages. Damp walls dripped with condensation, straw mattresses grew moldy, and malnutrition weakened bodies already starved from hunger. A cough could spiral into fever in just days. Children's cheeks hollowed, their energy drained, until they lay silent under patchwork blankets. The elderly fared no better. Their frail lungs, already worn thin by years of labor, couldn't fight off the infection. The sound of coughing became part of the storm's soundtrack. From cottage to cottage, across crowded tenements, you could hear it, a grim chorus that told neighbors sickness was spreading, and everyone knew the truth. Once the cough set in, survival was uncertain. Entire families sat in silence, listening to the rasp of a child's breath, every wheeze like a countdown. Imagine the fear of those nights. You're a parent, holding your child, feeling their small chest heave against you as they cough endlessly. The fire still burns, Smoke curls in the air, frost creeps across the walls, and you know you have nothing left to give but hope. Some children lived, many did not. And when a child's coughing suddenly stopped in the middle of the night, the silence that followed was worse than any storm outside. Neighbors buried the dead quickly once the thaw came, sometimes in shallow graves dug into half-frozen soil. Tiny mounds multiplied in churchyards, each one a reminder of how merciless winter could be. The wealthy mourned too, but with more comfort: funeral services, warm carriages, family tombs. For the poor, grief was raw, silent, and often endured alone. And yet, the cough carried lessons. Survivors never forgot it. Children who lived through those winters grew into adults who hoarded food, who never trusted a cupboard to stay full, who always built their fires high against the cold. They remembered the sound of their siblings coughing in the dark, the nights spent wondering if dawn would come. The cough wasn't just illness. It was a symbol of the storm itself, quiet at first, then relentless, breaking bodies one breath at a time. And it reminded every survivor that in a Victorian snowstorm, death wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it crept in softly, riding on smoke and frost, hidden in the sound of a child's breath. But what happened when the fire itself went out? When families woke to silence, no coughing, no crackle of flames, only the crushing weight of cold? That's where survival reached its most desperate test. Hey guys, we've walked a long road together tonight. From the icy winds that rattled the poorest cottages, to the fragile flicker of candles guarding against the dark, to the quiet sacrifices of parents who gave up their own meals so their children might survive. This has been a journey through one of the harshest tests the Victorian poor ever faced. And yet, what stands out most is not just the misery, but the resilience. Every ember saved, every rag stitched into a blanket, every scrap of bread stretched beyond reason. These were not acts of desperation alone. They were acts of defiance. Proof that even when the storm pressed hardest, ordinary people refused to surrender. The wealthy endured with walls of stone and piles of coal, but the poor endured with something stronger: sheer will. They survived by sharing, by sacrificing, and by holding on to one another when the cold tried to break them apart. And though many were lost, those who endured carried forward a legacy of toughness, of resourcefulness, of love written in the smallest, quietest acts. Tonight, as you sit in warmth and comfort, take a moment to feel that contrast. We flip a switch for light. We twist a dial for heat. We open cupboards full of food from across the world. All of this security we barely notice, was built on the struggles of those who came before us. Their scars became our safety. Their resilience became our inheritance. And maybe, just maybe, there's a lesson for us too. To pause in gratitude. To see the value in the simple things we take for granted. To understand that survival is not just about strength, but about compassion. Because when the snow fell hardest, it wasn't wealth alone that saved lives. It was community. It was sacrifice. It was love. So, as we close this story and let the storm fade into history, let's carry that truth with us. The human spirit is stronger than frost, stronger than hunger, stronger than despair. It has been tested time and time again, and it has always found a way to endure. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched you, give it a like, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe so you won't miss the next forgotten struggle we bring back to life. And now, as the fire of our tale burns low, I'll leave you with this. Stay warm, stay grateful, and may your night be peaceful. Good night, friends. Sleep well and dream gently.